how important those codes are to us. Adobe Digital Editions. Star Trek_Deep Space Nine. A Stitch in Time. Andrew J. Robinson. EPUB window. Focus on book content text. You know how important those codes are to us. I don't have to tell you what that information means. No one knows better than I said. Of course not. And I respect that for whatever reason you're unable to continue to break them down for us. Yes. I prompted. You see, this is so difficult, Barack. I know what a private person you are, and how you detest people meddling in your affairs. Ironic for a spy, isn't it? Note, everyone has a right to their privacy, but circumstances being what they are. Captain Sisko would like it very much if I could somehow continue. Yes. With help, the doctor had finally gotten it out. Nothing would give me greater pleasure. But tell me, doctor, how am I to do this? I asked. The moment I see those scrambled characters, my throat tightens, and then when I start working on them, I shrugged. How could I explain the unexplainable? But you see, perhaps it's something that I can help you address. Your holosuite program. The one that allows me to visit the traumas of my childhood. I hesitate to suggest this, remembering how you reacted the last time. But, yes, I feel it could make a difference, the doctor gamely admitted. Oh, doctor, I sighed. We're so different. Perhaps someday I'll be able to express to you just how different we are. I pushed my food away, and took a deep breath to calm the rising anxiety. All of my so-called childhood traumas are right here in this room with me, at this moment. Yes, of course they are, the doctor readily agreed. But they're not hidden. They've happened, they've had their effect, and all of it is incorporated into who I am. I know this, the doctor assured me. No, you don't. Because you're operating from a psychological model that is human. Would you use a human model as your guide if you needed to perform a delicate surgical procedure on me? Of course I would. And you've proven that. Not knowing Cardassian biochemistry, you went to the Arawat colony to get the appropriate data from Tane himself in order to remove the wire from my brain. Why should this be any different? The question hung in the air. The doctor had no answer, and I could see by his expression that he was genuinely embarrassed by the situation. Please, doctor, I understand why you're asking this. But the stress, the anxiety, the fear a Cardassian experiences is about what hasn't happened. We've already processed the past. It's what's in front of us that's worrisome. And you don't think that what's in front of us has any connection to what's past? He asked. Of course it does, but not in the causal manner you're suggesting. One model does not fit all, however admirable that model may be. I smiled and gestured to the doctor, but he wasn't in the mood for a compliment. I am not trained in this field, Barack, and I'm not going to send us off on a fool's errand, but I ask you as a friend to help us however you can. This information could save countless lives. Help you by helping myself, you mean? However you can. You have my word, doctor. I will do whatever I possibly can. I've never doubted that, Barack. I nodded, looking at the third setting. Tell me, doctor, why did you invite Odo today? I thought since you were working together on this project. His voice trailed off. We just looked at each other. I think I was afraid to do this by myself, he finally admitted. Book content text. I appreciate your honesty, doctor. Please assure the captain that I will pick up more codes from Odo today. Thank you, Barack. The doctor seemed enormously relieved. He gestured to our food. I'm afraid it's all gone cold. Why don't we just go to the replement after all? Excellent suggestion, I eagerly agreed. The room was rapidly becoming much too confining. As we walked back out onto the promenade, I wondered what it was about my future that was suffocating me. And how could I overcome it? Even as I thought this, I had to force myself to breathe. Book content text. 8 entry : As I walked to the diplomatic service building, which was not far from the Hall of Records, I went over my cover information. I was to identify myself as Allard Igborn, the youngest son of Krai, the newly appointed consul to the Cardassian embassy on Do-H-Bun II, where the off-and-on Federation Cardassian peace talks were on again. I had to be extremely careful. I was warned with the military personnel who guarded the diplomatic compound. The military had their own security/intelligence apparatus, which did its best to discredit the Obsidian Order whenever possible. The military distrusted the Order and its seemingly autonomous position in the power structure. The fact that the Dectapa Council chose the Order rather than the military for its OH-1 undercover operations only exacerbated the rivalry. There were instances of joint operations between the two, but they were rare and only happened when the Council twisted arms. All right, pass through, the glint grudgingly allowed when my security code cleared. I smiled my thanks. This was completely ignored, and as I made my way to the appointed conference room I understood why the so-called rivalry was one-sided. The military mind doesn't lend itself to subtle and creative obfuscation. The first person I saw when I entered the room was Malady EK. He returned my look with a bored expression, and turned back to his comm chip. He was punctual for this meeting. Limer explained that Malady EK was my older brother Becom, and another member of our cell, Unal, was Craig, my father. As I studied the three of us, we did indeed look like the family. The purpose of the peace talks was to determine a settlement of the often violent Cardassian Federation border dispute that centered around several planets, Dorva V being the most important. During these talks a truce had been declared. The assignment, as far as I was involved, was disappointing. Unal was the experienced operative, and he was charged with the sole responsibility of working with his contacts on the Federation negotiating side. As probes, Malady EK and I were there to give credibility to Unal's cover, and beyond that simply to observe and learn. Learn your stories, follow orders, and serve Cardassian, Limer had admonished the two brothers. OH-1II is a pleasant if somewhat damp and cold planet on the Federation frontier. It's mainly an outpost for traders and those tourists interested in trekking the forested slopes of Mandaron, an enormous volcano that's been inactive for 2 centuries. The Cardassian Embassy compound, a bare-bones operation, consists of the main administration building and several attached residences, which were built as temporary shelters and over time became permanent. Malady EK and I were assigned adjoining residences. Because of the shoddy construction, each of us could hear everything the other was doing or saying. The circumstances made me self-conscious, and I tried to live quietly, but Malady EK thrashed about as if he was unaware or just didn't care. Odd behavior even for a novice security operative. His attitude toward me was guarded, but proper. Neither one of us talked about anything unrelated to our work, least of all Bamaran. Even with the recognition that had passed between us at the first meeting, I was uncertain if he remembered me and, if he did, whether he knew of my contribution to the outcome of the competition. This uncertainty kept me off balance. We were invited to all the social functions, and the reception at the Federation Embassy on the eve of the talks afforded me my first contact with humans. Before this evening, I had only seen them once from a distance, many years before when a delegation of Federation officials had attended the Tarlac funeral of Councillor Herod, who had been the leading proponent of a peaceful solution to the frontier wars, and whose name was invoked several times during the evening. Book content text. Malady EK seemed to be familiar. Book content text. Malady EK seemed to be familiar with human ways, and when he expressed the strong judgment that they were a stupid race, I assumed that he knew what he was talking about. Look at the Vulcan. He directed me to a tall man with sad eyes. They haven't the spine of a sandworm, but at least they're intelligent. They can grasp the complexities of a given political situation. I just hope Unal is equal to the challenge, he said as he changed his focus to our father, who was speaking with a short, graying human. You mean Craig? I corrected. We were strictly instructed to use our story names. Malady EK looked at me with the expression he usually reserved for humans. I think I'll try to have an intelligent conversation tonight. He moved off in the direction of the Vulcan, who was now standing alone. He does remember me, I thought, and he knows a role I played in the competition. I decided at that moment that I had to watch him as much as the enemy. Hello. I'd been so focused on Malady EK that I hadn't heard anyone approach. Standing next to me was a young human whose hair was as white as mine was black. I just stared at him. I'd never been this close to one of them. My name is Hans Jort, he said carefully, not sure if I was on another communication level. My name is Alardig Braylorn, I finally was able to reply. His insignia indicated that he held the rank of lieutenant, junior grade. He was solidly built, for a human, and his eyes were a shade of pale blue I'd never seen before. Forgive my ignorance, Hans began, but what sports do Carter Science play? Sports. The question was so odd that I thought we might indeed be on different levels. Games. Contests. Hans attempted to be helpful, but it only got worse. I suspected this was obviously a clumsy attempt to cover a deeper intent. Perhaps I should explain, he bravely continued, in the face of my utter incomprehension. A few of us are attempting to organize a game of football. Have you heard of it? Some people call it soccer. I've heard of it, but I'm afraid I wouldn't be of much help. Carta Science don't play. Then perhaps you'd like to learn. We could play among ourselves, I suppose. He indicated the other humans in the room. But I thought it might be interesting to get the other groups involved. Hans looked at me with such intense, blue-eyed openness that it was difficult to maintain any kind of distance. He was a junior member of the Federation delegation, and certainly an intelligence probe. But that wasn't the problem. I welcomed this contact. It was the football. We don't play sports, at least not the team sports that Federation people have been trying to popularize throughout the quadrant. I could accept boxing and wrestling, which were primitive forms of pit competition, but basketball was mindless monotony, and games like cricket and baseball were completely incomprehensible. I'd be pleased to participate, I replied, but how could I possibly contribute? I know nothing about the game. As much as I wanted to establish contact with these people, I certainly didn't want to make a fool of myself. Yes, of course, Hans nodded in agreement. But there is one position that does not require skill so much as athletic ability. He then gave me a lengthy and rather boring description of the game: defenders, midfielders, strikers working together to push the ball they were not allowed to touch with their hands or arms into an opponent's goal. Hans suggested that I participate as a goalkeeper. You see, all you would have to do is prevent your opponent from putting the ball into your goal. And I can't use my hands. I asked. No. The goalkeeper can use any part of his body, Hans replied with the widest grin I have ever seen on a face. Children and their games, I thought. I had no idea of what I was getting into, but I agreed to defend one of the goals. It was at least a concept I understood. After the reception, as I was laying out what I was going to wear for the next day's football match, I could hear Malady Ek in his residence. He was talking as he moved about. His voice was too soft for me to tell if he was talking to himself, into a recording device, or to someone else. I, book content text, realized that I had lost track of him after I'd made contact with Hans, and I didn't see him for the rest of the evening. At one point, he laughed a loud bark, really, and what sounded like a bottle crashed against the wall. There was a long silence punctuated intermittently by a sound I could only describe as a painful moan. A strange person, I thought as I fell into a disturbed sleep. Cut off his angle, alarm dig. I heard Hans instruct me as the striker broke through the defense with skillful control of the ball. I was all that was left between him and the goal. It was happening with the speed of a dream. The striker, a short, wraith-like Starfleet officer they called Mahmoud, feinted to my left, and my inexperience followed him. Just as my weight committed, he easily cut back to my right and kicked the ball into the back of the goal net. Ah yes, I thought, I understand now. That won't happen again. And it didn't. For the remainder of the match I calculated distance, angle, and speed in such a way that Mahmoud's goal was their last. Hans was quite impressed with what he called my uncanny anticipation, and suggested that I should pursue the game and introduce it to Carta Science. I smiled and imagined what would happen to this game if we adopted it. If they give yellow cards as warnings for slight infractions, and expel a player for the hard bump, kick, or trip, then a group of Carta Science would be gone in a matter of minutes. Even in today's game, there were complaints about the vigor of my defense, and I was trying to be sporting, to use the Federation expression. In our games you win by eliminating your opponents, or at the least severely limiting their ability to compete. Still, it was quite instructive, especially during the time which was most of the match when the action was away from me and I was able just to observe. There is undoubtedly a skill to the game, and most people play to win. Indeed, humans are capable of being every bit as aggressive as Carta Science, but they exhibited such a childlike joy and enthusiasm as they played that I came to understand another meaning of the word game. What was more puzzling, however, was watching those people who played the game for no other reason than to just play. If they or one of their teammates made a mistake, if the opposition scored, they didn't seem to mind. Some even laughed it off. And at the end, everyone actually shook hands and congratulated each other. They read not stupid. Malady EK has dangerously underestimated them. But there's something we don't understand about these humans that limits our effectiveness in dealing with them. There was quite a crowd for the match, which was due more to the fact that, other than hiking or turbo-gliding or attending embassy functions, there wasn't much to do on H1II. At the beginning I noticed Malady EK watching with a tall Vulcan. Hans told me that he had tried to get Malady EK as the other goalkeeper. I wasn't surprised that he'd refused. It was clear to me that he found his time better spent with the Vulcan, who was also a non-player. When we came back from the interval, the two of them had disappeared. Thank you, Alardig, Hans said to me at the reception for the players. I can't get over how well you controlled your goal. Perhaps Carter-Science have the ideal temperament for the position, I have joked. Too bad you didn't get Becalmed for the other goal. Then we might not have won, Hans laughed. But tell me, is he not feeling well? Becalmed. I asked. Yes. I only asked because he seemed perturbed when I approached him about the match. He's always perturbed, I said without thinking. At that moment I understood two things. I didn't like Malady EK, and I had made a huge mistake. Hans was looking at me with his open face, so seemingly free of guile or ulterior intent. I immediately covered my misstep with a laugh and desperately tried to think of something that would mitigate my remark. But the laugh was artificial, and the longer Hans stood there smiling at me! The more I felt a fool. Of course, far from being stupid, these people know exactly what they're doing. Hans also knew what he was doing when he asked me to goalkeep. It was clear that they had more information about me than I had about them. And Malady EK knew all this as well. Book content text. The thought struck me as I made my way to the service compound, where I was to meet Leimer. He was posing as an embassy employee, although I hadn't seen him since I'd arrived. I sent him a message that I wanted a meeting as soon as possible, and he directed me to the groundskeeping building. I didn't know what else to do. As a junior probe I had limits, but what were they? How much do I respond to Hans's obvious interest in me? And what did I do about my increasing uneasiness concerning Malady EK? The shadow moved, and Leimer was next to me. Come with me, he said. Where had he come from? I followed as he quickly led me behind the building, through a back door, and into a small room I took to be the groundskeeper's office. What is it? We stood in the darkness. It's Malady EK. It's also the Starfleet junior officer, Hans Jort. It's also me. I struggled to organize my thoughts. I knew somehow there was a coherence, but I didn't have enough information to put it together for myself. Leimer watched me, waiting patiently. I decided to start at the beginning. I told him about Bamaran and the competition and how I was certain that Malady EK remembers not only who I am, but the part I played in his defeat. I told him about Malady EK's contact with the Vulcan, his behavior with me and the sounds that were coming from his room. And I told him about Hans, the football match, and my unthinking reply to his interest in Malady EK's well-being. I know something's going on, Leimer, but I'm missing something. Perhaps if I had more information. You read here to observe and to learn, Leimer reminded me. Information comes if your assignment expands. Otherwise, continued. He nodded dismissal and I started to leave. You can hear Malady EK. He can't hear you. I stood at the door, letting this sink in and breathe once before you answer any questions. As I walked back to the residence I understood that my assignment had expanded. I also understood that this expansion had been anticipated when I'd been given my residence. Very little is left to chance in this work. Even the lack of preparation for dealing with humans, which had so irritated me and had made me think that Leimer had been Remus, served a valuable purpose. Hans Jort would not have shown such interest, I'm sure, if I had behaved in a prepared manner. The skill, I realized, was to assimilate these lessons without losing my innocence. When I entered the residence, I immediately placed a chair next to the wall that connected to Malady EK's. He was in there, restlessly moving about and muttering. I could only try to imagine the state of mind that impelled anyone to behave with such agitation. Not satisfied with my listening post, I tested various parts of the wall for better hearing. Not only did I find a slight indentation that allowed me to hear perfectly, but it also contained a cleverly disguised eyepiece that gave me a wide-angle view of Malady EK's room. Why hadn't they told me about this to begin with? Because, my voice patiently explained, any expansion also depends upon information I uncovered myself. Another piece of the mosaic. Malady EK was moving about the room as if he were being chased by fire. His muttering came in scattered bursts, and there were times when I was convinced other people were in the room with him. I could only make out the occasional word, and only then if it was repeated, like yonic, which is what a young child calls his or her father. There was much about betrayal and someone called the betrayer. As he harangued the room, he helped himself liberally from a bottle of Crinux, a strong drink fermented from local berries. It was a pathetic sight, and one I never would have guessed from the self-contained superiority of his public face. I watched him until he drank himself into a stupor and fell asleep in his clothes. The closest thing I could liken his behavior to was a man defending himself desperately before a chief archon who had judged him guilty. But even more disturbing was the impression that this presumption of guilt was driving him mad. That night, my dreams reflected just how disturbed I was. Somehow I was barely hanging onto a steep ledge high up on a huge rock formation that dominated the Mither wilderness. In front of me was the flat summit and safety. Behind me was a sheer drop into the jagged outcropping of the formation and certain death. The figure was on the summit offering me the rope to hold onto. The sun was behind the figure and I couldn't make out who it was. I kept repeating, "Who are you?" But the person wouldn't answer. I refused to take the rope until he did answer.